Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joseph Neuberger, and this is Neuberger and Partners live on Facebook with an update from the legal perspective with respect to what is changing during this COVID-19 pandemic. And last week we did about 30 minutes and updated many of our followers and also clients and other lawyers who are watching these live videos. So let me talk to you a little bit about some recent restrictions, because I continue to get email and phone inquiries about what is going on with respect to the health directives underneath the powers that the province have with respect to the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. Not so much now the Quarantine Act, but I'll just repeat that if somebody is a traveler and has come back to Canada and they were quarantined for 14 days, the Quarantine Act mandates that the person remains in their residence quarantined, which means they can't even go for a walk or go for shopping. They're stuck there. And any transgression of those conditions in the Quarantines Act can result in severe punishment, including prosecution, high fines, or in some cases jail. So you need to be very careful that if anybody is watching this and they're in quarantine, I'm sorry, and I hope you're well, and I hope you do very well, but make sure you obey the Quarantine Act. And actually, before I really get started, I should also say and give a thank you to a number of groups of people in our community. So first of all, to all the frontline workers who are out there helping keep this city, province, and this country functioning and working at grocery stores and all the essential places. I happen to have a daughter who I do love very much, and she's in a store with lots of protective gear and a lot of protective measures, but she wants to be there to help make sure that people are getting their necessities of life. And so we appreciate this very much, as well as to all the doctors, nursing staff, assistants in hospitals, and all paramedics, firefighters, police, etc., who are doing their very best to keep our city safe and help people recover. So thank everybody very much for that type of help and taking the risk when you are out there in the community. Now, just to go back to the health directives. So the province and the city can issue many directives restrictions of people's movements within the city, and we all know that we are to have physical distancing. I'm no longer referring to it as social distancing, because really it's physical distancing, and we should be at least 6 feet apart, if not really 2 meters, because we are Canadian, we talk about meters, and it's important that we maintain that distance. And they are actively enforcing these rules. We don't have the same amount of enforcement in every area on every day, but we have seen, and I've witnessed personally, that there are by law enforcement officers, police, that are out there issuing tickets, and the minimum fine is now $1,000, which is quite sizable, and it's extremely important that people obey this. And the province and the city derives their powers from the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. So it's proper legislation, and the issues with respect to constitutional rights about the freedom to associate, etc., that's not going to fly when it comes to a pandemic, because it's the collective good which is important. And I think it's important for anybody who is communicating on social media to be as accurate as possible with facts. There's too much going out there which is not accurate. I would have used another word, but I'm going to try not to. And it's important that we do our part, because over the next 2 to 3 weeks we'll probably and hopefully see the spike, and then to see, as they say, that curve come down. And we need eventually for our society to come back to some level of normalcy. So it's very important that people are obeying these directives, and they are staying at home and not attending public places unless it's absolutely necessary, and it's out for the dog walk or some fresh air, which is important, but be very careful and make sure we're abiding by it. Just to note, I've been asked a few times through emails and phone calls about public park areas. So Initially, green spaces like trails and other parks were open to walk through, jog, or ride through. The problem is people have been congregating too much in too tight clusters that has caused real concern for the medical individuals involved with our government who are giving expert advice, as well as our politicians who are trying to enforce the message which is getting out to stay away from people. So just to give you an idea, there's been a number of problems with places like Sunnyside Park, Hyde Park, and they are now considering, I don't know if John Tory or Mayor has done it yet, but considering closing down Hyde Park and carefully monitoring the waterfront in these areas to make sure that people are obeying these directives. And if people obey these directives, we can still have these green spaces to use, which is important for our mental health and our physical health. But we need to really abide by them. And again, the fines are a minimum of $1,000. In rare circumstances, there could be prosecution, which would result in jail, but those are rare circumstances. And if anybody, sadly enough, has COVID-19, God willing, you're doing well and you're able to recover, and that's what we all hope. But those individuals should not, under any circumstances, be out in public areas until their quarantine time is over. So that covers sort of the Quarantine Act and the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act. And again, my message is for everybody to please be responsible to ensure that they are not out in the public in a circumstance where they're clustering with individuals, but they're obeying those directives, please. And right now, we all have to keep our outside activities to a minimum. Now, just to talk a little bit of something more boring, our practice. So criminal law is still working. We're an essential service, and people are still being arrested, and we are dealing with our clients mostly through remote video and teleconferencing. We have very strict measures in place with respect to ensuring our staff is protected, as well as clients that we're speaking to. We're working on shortened hours, and most of the time we're working remotely. And so we are very careful about protecting staff as well as protecting our clients. And when I say staff, really, that it's a family here, so we want to make sure that everybody is safe and taken care of. But we are available almost 24 hours a day for emergencies and have been receiving emergency contact. By way of update as well with the courts, the Superior Court is starting to come to the realization that it's the year 2020 and some technology needs to be implemented. And I'm not being critical, but it's important that our Superior Court, when it comes to family law, civil litigation, as well as criminal matters, has and will develop the technological capability to conduct certain things in a certain, like motions and appearances, in a manner where people don't necessarily have to attend. They are doing a very good job, both with the Superior Court and the Ontario Court of Justice, for us to be in contact with Crown attorneys, for us getting access to disclosure for our client, and conducting judicial pretrials. And I commend everybody within the criminal justice system, including Crown attorneys, judges, justices of peace, and defense lawyers, in continually ensuring that they're trying to keep matters moving for their clients, and people's rights are being respected. The Ontario Court of Justice, which is the lower level, it doesn't mean it's not important. It's extremely important. The majority of our cases are dealt with in the Ontario Court of Justice, and judges are working hard to try and manage these cases on an ongoing basis. But as for people who are on a release order, so they're on a bail or an undertaking to stay out of jail, it's important that we keep track of all the matters, and the courts are doing a good job to keep track of all that. But the ability for the Ontario Court of Justice to now conduct trials or in-person guilty pleas for people who are out of custody, or withdraw matters and other such, is very limited at the moment. And the news that we have still right now is that the courts are essentially going to be closed till the end of May, and we'll see whether they are going to be able to open for early June or mid-June. My guess is probably sometime in June, if everybody does their part now and we're able to, get control of this virus and stem the tide of its expansion, then we're able to maybe open those courts. Because the reality is for clients who are with us, it's very stressful to have a case hanging over their head, and now for some sort of an indefinite period of time, because it's extremely stressful and emotional, and nobody should assume that because a person's charged they're guilty. That's not the case, and people's rights have to be protected, and so it's a very careful balancing that goes on. And so we are hoping that the Ontario Court of Justice will be able to open for business as usual sometime in June. If not June, I'm sure July will be the time. Same with the Superior Court. And they are implementing now more video conferencing. And in fact, in one case we have right now, we're trying to set up a way to complete a case where we have to make submissions. And we're trying to see if we can do that by a video conference, which would include all of the stakeholders in the trial, but we'll see if we'll be able to do that. Again, for people who are in custody, emergency bail hearings are still being conducted, and certain matters are still ongoing with the courts, and there's more advances being made in that every day. With respect to the future, I'm going to talk about this a little bit because I've received some requests for commentary about what's happening with bails. And there are a number of cases now where people who are charged with very serious offenses are receiving bail when in the ordinary course they might not. And members of the public might be going that this is an absolute tragedy that people who are charged with very serious offenses, including an accessory to an attempt murder or drug trafficking or other cases, are receiving bail. And I understand the public concern and sentiment about that. But the reason judges are releasing individuals on bail and doing so under very strict terms where police will be monitoring the terms of the bail is because even though that right now there's a low incidence of this virus being within closed detention centers and correctional centers, it really takes one or two people who are carrying the virus and may not even be symptomatic to spread it. And in such a closed environment, it can spread like wildfire and cause severe harm to those who are in custody, as well as the staff who are dedicated to working within those facilities and doing the best they can to keep everybody healthy. But they too have families. And so we have to consider everybody in this. And I say this a lot, even though people don't necessarily ascribe to the view, but especially in times of such a crisis, a society is really judged by not just how we treat those who are the productive, socially minded, good people of our society, but also those who are at the other end of the spectrum, those who are charged with offenses and those who are in custody. Because as a civil society, we want to do everything possible to protect everybody. And that's what separates us from other societies. That protects us from becoming a closed society where we don't respect human rights. And as difficult as it may seem to an outside observer in the community who has no contact with the criminal justice system to see that it would be a loss of confidence in the administration of justice that somebody charged with an offense which is very serious is now out on bail. The flip side of that is we need to take measures to protect the health of these individuals, the health of the people within the jails, as well as the people who work there, and put at the foremost here is the health and safety of everybody in our communities. And this treatment, this way that we deal with this in a very civilized, caring manner is really what distinguishes us in Canada. And I have always said we have one of the best criminal justice systems in the world. We have an outstanding social structure and generally good government. I will have some comments later about the federal government, but they've been doing a good job And our provincial government has been doing a very good job as well. I'm very impressed with the leadership that's been coming from the current government. Recently, the cooperation between our Premier and Ms. Freeland, who's the deputy Prime Minister, in securing this deal of 3M just shows how cooperation and how good, when politicians work together, good things can be achieved. But we are very fortunate to be in Canada. And so the way we are treating these inmates and people who are charged with offenses in a civilized manner, looking out for their health and safety, and those are the people who work within these facilities, is important. And it's a hallmark of who we are as a society. So I may be saying flowery words to people that they may not be accepting, but the reality is I think this is very important. That runs into two other issues. There are also instances where people who are in custody serving time, so they're incarcerated, serving a sentence, and are receiving releases on sort of early parole or a compassionate parole, and the authorities are taking into consideration risk assessment, which is very important, but also health and safety issues. And this is something where a person would be released, but these releases are not just, go walk in the community and do whatever you want. There are terms on them. They are monitored. There are strict conditions that have to be imposed. And I'm fairly confident that they will be observed in the sense that those who are in place to supervise and to manage that risk will be doing that. But it's also a part of an unusual time in our lives where things have changed drastically and our outlook on how we deal with things have changed. The other thing I'm going to say for those of you who are interested in these criminal law issues, and again, I'm getting these inquiries from current clients and then new people who are coming to us with offenses, is what's going to happen eventually with the cases that are in the system and are being adjourned now, which is being put over. So we know that this has started mid-March and may continue to June and even through June. So tens of thousands of cases have been adjourned and trials have been adjourned. And so this eventually will cause a pressure on the criminal justice system in order to get them rescheduled and dealt with. So I think at some point, and I raised this as an issue, that those who have the authority, like Crown attorneys and judges in judicial pretrials, to assess what we call reasonable prospect of conviction and the ability to assess whether it's in the public interest to prosecute a case, will have to very carefully take a look at issues with respect to whether there is sufficient evidence, whether there's enough compelling evidence to prosecute a case, and whether to determine if it's in the public interest as well to prosecute cases, just simply because I think we're going to get to a point where there's going to be a tremendous amount of pressure on the justice system. And so some cases which will be at the lower end, where there can be alternative ways of dealing with it to deal with the conduct, and in many cases, again, clients are not guilty. I don't want anybody to assume because somebody's charged that they're guilty. That is not the case. We defend lots of cases every year where there are really innocent people being prosecuted, and I'm not going to get into the details of why that happens or somehow suggest that this is because of the fault of police or somebody, but that's for another discussion at a later time. But we have to ensure that everybody's rights are protected, but we also have to be practical that when this ends, there will be resources, and there's only so much we can do within that resource structure. And so at some point, there will have to be realistic assessments of cases that have come into the system or that are currently in the system as to whether they are worthy of continued prosecution. And maybe we think in a more holistic or alternative way of dealing with these cases in order to ease that burden a little bit. What's good is that the government is still appointing judges. Recently, there have been some very good appointments to the Superior Court, to the Court of Appeal, and to the Ontario Court of Justice, outstanding candidates who are now judges. And so there are resources being applied. So we are appointing judges so that we can handle this in the future. But this will be a lot of work for Crown attorneys and for judges, as well as defense lawyers. And we're going to have a realistic approach to what is a realistic case that should go forward. So I'll leave that. There's just a couple of other issues to discuss before I'll sign off on this live feed. This is not criminal law related, so I continue to express my support for small local business. My soon-to-be wife and I make efforts to ensure that we buy locally from small businesses like small grocery stores and restaurants in order to help businesses survive this very difficult economic time. This is a pause on the economy that's been artificially imposed because of the pandemic. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been economic suffering. There's been tremendous economic suffering. And the reality is, I think one of the stats was 10 or maybe 20% of restaurants and other businesses that are small proprietorships closed permanently. And down the road, we're going to have some very serious economic issues to confront. And for example, the wage subsidy, which is being reworked again now to see if it will help small business, is still not enacted by government. They have to convene Parliament to put it into law. We're going to need to have that happen relatively soon. And a diminution of 30% in profit may be a high mark if a company wants to sustain paying their employees, like a small business of a law firm, which we do, even though we can't go to court. And I think it's important for us to think together as a society and have our government and our politicians within the government engaged in thinking creatively about how we're going to be able to support these small businesses and employees going forward. Because when we start to emerge or have an exit plan from the restrictions which we're in now, we're going to need a very well thought out economic plan to help everybody from the low wage workers all the way up, because businesses suffer at all levels, and we need to ensure that people are able to have a good wage where they're able to support their families and support themselves, as well as sustain employment. Because if the unemployment numbers go up drastically, which everybody's expecting and has already gone up, and we're not able to reintegrate these people into the economy by way of creating these jobs, we're in trouble. And so I think we're going to have to look at other mechanisms to give incentives to businesses and small businesses to try and survive this economic crunch that's happening, and to ensure that we're going to be employing people at the wages that will support them. So I know this has nothing to do with criminal law. I'm talking as a small business owner and as a person who's worked in the community for over 30 years. I started working when I was 13, and the reality is it's very important that we start to think about creative measures as we develop an exit plan. And those measures are going to have to include, as much as our federal government might not like this, some sort of tax credits or tax cuts that will help all Canadians, including, I think, the basic exemption, which is now, I think, at $12,069 to go up, because we have to help people at all levels. So that's just my thought on what we're going to have to do about the economy, and we're going to have to start thinking about this. But from a law perspective, things are going on. It's on a bit of a pause, but I think we'll get back on track as we start to stem the tide on the spread of this virus. And I'm hoping we'll be able to get there. And for people who are within the system now, or the criminal justice system, or are charged for whatever reason, there are many lawyers out there to help. We're available to help, and you will get that help that you need. Things may not resolve as quickly as possible because of the way the system's working right now, but people are available to assist. And lastly, in closing, I just want to make sure that everybody continues to please follow these instructions from the scientists and the medical professionals and our government, and that we maintain the physical distancing and do what we can together to try and stem the tide on this virus, and that everybody stays well and remains healthy and happy and is creative within their families or at home to try and find ways to keep themselves not just mentally healthy, but also occupied, so that you're thinking and doing things and reading, and maybe use this time as a way to try and re-energize yourself when we we work on a daily basis and don't have the time to enjoy the little things. So I hope everybody's well. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll check in with you in either a week or 2 weeks. Thank you and take care.